It's a pleasure to welcome you to Jewish Cuisines, the local and the global. I'm Terry Gordon, the director of the Jewish Cultural Studies program at the New School for Public Engagement. Before introducing the panelists, I would like to thank the people who have made this event possible. Above all, I want to thank Fabio Parasacoli, the coordinator of food studies at the New School for Public Engagement, who unfortunately could not be here due to an engagement in Italy. Fabio is the creative force and energy behind this event. Many thanks as well to our wonderful marketing team, Pamela Tillis, Amy Orr, Robert Dinardi, and others who did such an outstanding job planning and promoting the symposium. A note of gratitude to the co-sponsors of this event, the Food Studies Program and the Jewish Cultural Studies Program of the New School for Public Engagement, and the Consulate General of Israel in New York. Finally, I would like to thank the Posen Foundation for their generous support. I will briefly introduce our panelists and then turn the discussion over to our moderator, Val Vinokur, who is the Director of Jewish Studies at Eugene College. There will be an authentic kosher reception after the event, and you are all welcome and invited to stay and enjoy the food. Okay, we have a wonderful group of speakers tonight. June Feiss Hersh, you want to just, is the author of Recipes Remembered, a celebration of survival, a remarkable collection of stories and recipes of Holocaust survivors. She has also written a cookbook entitled The Kosher Carnivore. Her goal as a food archivist is to preserve food memory. Ted Merwin is a professor of religion and Judaic studies at Dickinson College. He is the author of In Their Own Image, New York Jews and Jazz Age Popular Culture, as well as the forthcoming Pastrami on Rye, an overstuffed history of the Jewish deli. Michele Scicolone is an award-winning food writer and the author of 17 cookbooks. Her latest work is The French Slow Cooker. She is also the author of The Italian Slow Cooker, The Sopranos Family Cookbook, and Entertaining with the Sopranos. Finally, Naama Shefi is an Israeli food specialist dedicated to the preservation of Jewish culinary traditions and the promotion of Israeli cuisines. She was the director of public programs and events at the Consulate General of Israel in New York and recently established the organization MANA, the New Hebrew Pantry. Our format tonight is that each of our panelists will speak for about 10 or 15 minutes, and then Val will launch the discussion by asking a few questions, and we'll then turn the forum over to you. So please, June, to you. Thank you.
So not me. It relieves me of one hand that I normally use, because I think when you talk about Jewish food, you have to use your hands. We are a tactile group of people. We need to touch things and feel things and create things. And I think that really applies to so many cultures and so many traditions. But coming from my background, I feel it is ingrained. I think it's as natural to me as walking or speaking. Talking about Jewish food is something I've only been doing for 4 years. I've been eating Jewish food all my life. Anyone who has a Jewish grandmother or a Jewish mother has been eating Jewish food. And the one thing that strikes me is, what does that really mean? Because we don't have a country that we point to. I know Naama is going to talk about Israeli food, but is that Jewish food? So what is Jewish food? Well, sometimes I say that we have been thrown out of all the best countries in the world. Think about it. We've lived in Spain, we've lived in Italy, we've lived in France, we've lived in Greece, and I feel that Jewish food is a composite of everything we've adapted and adopted from all the different cultures that we've ever been exposed to. And we've integrated those cooking styles into our style of cooking. I learned that most clearly when I began working on Recipes Remembered. It is a serious book filled with remarkable stories of an amazing community of Holocaust survivors. And yet, it is a happy, joyful celebration. And you wonder, how do you bridge from Holocaust survival stories to joy and enthusiasm and resilience and strength? And it's the easiest bridge because there's a thread that runs through all the stories. And it runs through my life. I'm sure it runs through all of your lives. It's the thread of food. Food is what takes us from those wonderful moments at the start of our life, and it weaves through our lives, and it's what nourished and nurtured us for decades. It's what is embedded in my memory. It's those food memories that are so important. We can all walk into a bakery or a deli or a restaurant, and there could be a smell, an aroma, and it takes you back. And that's the Jewish food that fills the book Recipes Remembered. And yet, there's nothing really that makes it Jewish. A roast con pollo, a recipe given to me by Ruth Cohen, a survivor who found herself in the Dominican Republic. What makes a roast con pollo a Jewish dish? Simple. It was made by a Jewish woman. It was served at her Rosh Hashanah table. It's a Jewish dish. What makes lentil soup a Jewish dish? It was made by a Sephardic survivor who hid in the woods in outskirts of Greece. It's a Jewish dish. It's not typical food, yet it's the food that most people associate with Jewish people. Brisket, kugel, chopped liver, matzo ball soup. Nothing inherently Jewish about any of those dishes. It's just good global cuisine. But we associate it with Jewish food because it's the food that we ate growing up. It's the food that you find in the restaurants and the bakeries. When you see crumb cake, streuselkuchen, to my survivors, that's Jewish food. That's what they ate. That's what they grew up in. So it doesn't have to be challah to make it Jewish. It doesn't have to be ritual food to make it Jewish. It just has to be food that is identified with a Jewish tradition. That's what makes it Jewish food. The other thing that I find about all Jewish food, and I'm sure everyone is going to nod in agreement, it's the best food. Every single person you speak to, every survivor I spoke to, I was told that their dish was the best dish ever. It was the best matzo ball soup, the best kugel, the best brisket, the best chopped liver. And what I began to realize is that the best Jewish food is the one we associate with our holidays and our traditions. It's what made us feel safe and secure. It's the dishes that we could count on every year of being on our holiday table. I laugh because the best Jewish food I ever ate are my mother's matzo balls. They sink like little lead balls to the bottom of the bowl. If you ladle them in the cup too quickly, you run the risk of breaking the china. They're not floaters. Some of you make floaters. You put seltzer in them. They're not floaters, they're sinkers. And they lay in your stomach for the entire week of Passover. You know that Passover is over when the matzo balls exit. But they're the best Jewish food I ever ate because my mother made them. That's what makes, I think, our food, the food of Jewish people, so special because we associate it with such amazing memories. And in Recipes Remembered, my goal was to take those food memories that the Holocaust community brought forward with them through enduring the most unimaginable circumstances. And you say, what a hard link. How do you associate good memories with such a tragic period of time? But their lives weren't tragic. They lived through a tragic time. And they came through that with these wonderful food memories intact. And it's really our obligation. It's not even a choice. I don't think you have a choice. It's our obligation to make these dishes and to preserve food memory because our children and our children's children, we want them to have this same connection to these beautiful traditions. I'll tell a very quick story. Is that I ate at one of these really trendy West Village restaurants with one of my daughters who lives down here. And we went into the restaurant, and they were serving toasted buckwheat groats with caramelized onions and farfalle pasta. $17.95. And I laughed. It's kasha varnishkas. You can call these foods whatever you like. They're hip. They're trending. They're organic. They're locavores. They were locavores before anybody knew what the term meant. It's good, hearty, nutritious, comforting food. That's what Jewish food is to me. Thank you.
It's very nice to be back here. I spoke here about a year ago at a conference that was sponsored by the Posen Foundation for Secular Culture. And I talked about Seinfeld and Jewish food in Seinfeld and other popular Jewish television shows. Excuse me, my training is really in popular culture, in theater and film and television. And so food is something that I've gotten into only more recently. Although I grew up in Great Neck in a secular Jewish family. And we didn't belong to a synagogue. We went to the deli on Sunday nights. Or actually, we took out from the deli even more frequently. And I was the one who was always dispatched around the corner to Middle Neck Road to bring home the deli food. And it was always the same order: a pound of corned beef, no corned beef actually, no corned beef or pastrami or tongue, a pound of turkey, a pound of roast beef. This is how assimilated my family is. 12 slices of rye bread, a can of baked beans, vegetarian baked beans, and a little squat container of gravy. And when I brought that food home and I put it on the kitchen table, and my parents and my grandparents and my sister and I sat around and ate that food, it was like our Jewishness came in, you know. It was like that was what our Jewish identity really revolved around. And what's interested me in working on this book over the last several years is actually the ways in which deli food and the delicatessen itself became in many ways a kind of secular analog to the synagogue or to the sort of realm of the holy and the sacred. And it struck me that a few years ago when Katz's was actually, the owners of Katz's were thinking of selling the building to a real estate developer. There were articles in the press. I remember there was one in New York Magazine that said, you know, Katz's is the soul of New York Jewish culture. It's like a shrine. In the same way as I've seen air flight magazines on Air France and so on say that as soon as you get to New York, you have to run to the Carnegie Deli because it's the temple of Jewish gastronomy. And I started to think about the ways in which the delicatessen really became a kind of holy space for Jews. And that made more sense the more I thought about it, because you probably know that the ancient Hebrew religion also revolved around meat. It revolved around animal sacrifice. And it was interesting. I was in a deli in Boston not long ago, and I overheard the counterman joking with one of the customers. He gave her order, and he said to her, "Lady, I took a bite out of your sandwich before I wrapped it up for you. That's our form of quality control." And he was joking, you know, and she laughed and whatever. But I thought it was fascinating because this is exactly what happened. Well, it's not exactly what happened. But in the temple in Jerusalem, the priests, the Kohanim, would get a little portion. They would get the leftovers, but so it was the opposite way around. But they would get the leftovers of the animals that they were sacrificing to God. So in some ways, it was no surprise that the delicatessen paralleled that whole realm. And whenever I speak about the deli, of course, I show a lot of clips from movies and TV shows and so on. And I always show, if you know the Samurai Deli episode of Saturday Night Live with John Belushi, in which he plays a homicidal/suicidal deli owner, serving a very, very difficult customer. And then I followed that up with the Soup Nazi episode from Seinfeld, right? Because of course, it wasn't just that the deli owner was, and the person who was slicing the meat was performing an activity that was central to the community's self-definition, but also he was in a particular relationship with the customers and the waiter as well. And I'm fascinated by the whole phenomenon of the deli waiter, who was stereotypically extremely obnoxious and nasty, right? And supercilious, almost in the way that the French waiters in Paris, you know, are. but and why that should be so. That there should be that hostility that is so characteristic of the relationship between the customer and the server in a Jewish delicatessen. So this is all to say that in some ways my interest is, even though I'm interested in the food and I love deli food, and every time I'm in New York I make a beeline actually to the Second Avenue Deli, but I'm just as interested in the context, in the social spaces in which that food was consumed. And so I'm fascinated by all these dimensions of the holy. I'm equally fascinated by the way in which deli meats, and I am very focused on meats, I have to say. Some people define delicatessen in different ways, particularly outside New York. I think in New York we have delis and we have appetizing stores, and they're all kind of separate, right? Outside of New York, it often is combined, and people say, well, the only place to get a good bagel is in the delicatessen, and that always confuses me. Like, why would you go to a deli for a bagel? But it's all kind of smushed together. But I am focused on meats. But also the ways in which these meats have often had not just these very high and holy associations, but also very kind of low and you would say sort of Rabelaisian and vulgar associations. The word delicatus, which is the root word of delicatessen, a lot of people think the word delicatessen comes from the word essen, to eat, in German and in Yiddish. It actually doesn't. It comes originally from the Latin word delicatus. Delicatus means delicate, fine, or delicious, I guess, is the way we would probably translate it. And it wasn't used specifically of food or exclusively of food, but it was used of whatever people found to be appetizing. So, for example, there's a phrase in Latin, the puer delicatus, the delicious boy, who was, in a culture that was very open to homosexuality, the boy who was the object of an older man's erotic attentions. So I don't think it's any accident that over time, delicatessen foods took on a lot of sexual associations, and they still carry those kinds of sexual associations. You walk into a delicatessen and you have these salamis that are hanging from the ceiling. This is not a game of hide the salami. It's quite the opposite. And it's hard not to get away from some of those phallic associations. Actually, if you've ever thought about the phrase, do you know the slogan, send a salami to your boy in the army, right? You have to say it with that New York accent, which I've been in Pennsylvania for 10 years and I'm unfortunately completely losing. But send a salami to your boy in the army, right? Why would you send a salami? Why a salami? Why send this phallic symbol to your son who is serving his country in the military? Right? You would think that's the last thing he needs, right? But in a way, it's right. If you want him to come home safely, you want to sort of, buttress his virility and his masculinity, and so you send him a salami so he can, right? I mean, it's very Freudian, I guess, but it works. So how much time do I have? Is anyone keeping track here? Because I could go on for a long time about this. A couple more minutes. So I'll just sort of go quickly sort of through the history. The modern delicatessen is thought to have originated in the gourmet food stores that opened up in Europe after the French Revolution and other wars and revolutionary upheavals as retail stores that catered to the rising bourgeoisie and that employed the chefs who were all suddenly out of work. And so eating in a delicatessen was an opportunity to show off your rising social position and social status by eating foods that were imported from all over the world. And the delicatessen in France is essentially, I think, the charcuterie, in Italy, the saluminerie, and in Germany, which is where delicatessen absolutely reached its height, the delicatessen with a K. Delicatessens came to the United States in the mid-19th century, brought by Germans at first, and then brought perhaps by German Jews, but certainly by Jews who wanted to provide a kind of early form of fast food, I guess you would say, a kosher takeout food. Delicatessens were not restaurants. They didn't add tables until the early years of the 20th century. So in the 1880s, 1890s, when Jews were starting to flood in from Eastern Europe, there were no delicatessens like we might think of them today, where you would actually go and be able to sit down and eat. The most popular place where you would go and sit down and eat on the Lower East Side, anybody know? Where would people go if they wanted particularly we're talking about immigrants, they didn't have a lot of money. For just a few pennies, where you could go and you could eat, you could go out on a date. Yeah, Renee. What? No, what kind of, what? I wasn't thinking of a particular name of a restaurant. I was thinking of a type of eating place. I mean, there were saloons. There were what? Actually, there were candy stores, right? I mean, we don't really have candy stores anymore. So maybe Economy Candy, right? Was it Rivington Street? We don't really have candy, but the soda fountain, right? That's where people would go and where vaudeville acts would kind of try out in the back room. So the delicatessen really was slow to take off. And although Hasia Diner and other historians have, kind of said that the delicatessen really starts on the Lower East Side, I don't see it so much as starting on the Lower East Side. It's becoming an important part of Jewish culture for immigrant Jews, but it's really in the second generation when the delicatessen becomes, really reaches its height and really becomes a central part of Jewish culture in New York. And the corner kosher deli becomes the cornerstone of secular Jewish life. There are over 1,500 kosher delicatessens in New York, mostly concentrated in the Bronx and in Brooklyn in the 1930s. At the height of the Depression, when you would think people don't have money, they're not eating out, but they were. They depended on the delicatessen for that ethnic solidarity. And I'm running out of time, but just very quickly, after World War II, there's Jews are moving to the suburbs, and there's a real decline in the delicatessen. In some ways, this is a very fruitful period for me, the second half of the 20th century, because this is when, in some ways, the delicatessen gravitates from being actually, ensconced on every street corner to being more metaphorically ensconced in popular culture. And this is when you start to get, all kinds of dramatic and cinematic kinds of representations of the delicatessen. My favorite one, without a doubt, being the 1989 Rob Reiner film, When Harry Met Sally, which I have a lot of fun with whenever I give lectures on the delicatessen, because there's a lot going on in that scene, which is really a rip-off, a takeoff of a scene in Woody Allen's Annie Hall, in which Al Singer takes Annie Hall to the Carnegie delicatessen and she orders the wrong sandwich, the pastrami and white bread with mayonnaise. Nowadays, and we can talk about this maybe during the question and answer period if people are interested, nowadays there seems to be a little bit of a resurgence of the delicatessen, and there are new delicatessens that are opening up in New York and other places. There's an effort to sort of marry the delicatessen with sustainability, but whether or not that will hold, remains to be seen. Thank you.
Growing up in New York as an Italian American, I knew nothing whatsoever about Italian Jewish cuisine. It was a complete novelty to me to realize that there was a Jewish aspect to Italian cuisine. And it wasn't until the first time I visited Italy in 1970 on my honeymoon that I visited the Roman ghetto. And I realized that, wow, this is sensational. There's this whole aspect of Italian cooking that I was familiar with many of the dishes, but I didn't identify them as being Jewish dishes. And I realized that there was a history here that I knew nothing about. And I wanted to learn more about because I absolutely am fascinated by history, Italian culture, Italian food. And so this Jewish aspect was something that really needed to be explored. So one of the first things I learned was that the first Jewish settlement in Rome was probably a delegation from Judea over 2,000 years ago. They settled in Rome about 159 BC. And the historians believe that they were diplomats to the Roman court, and the first synagogue appears to be one that was built in Ostia, which is the port of Rome. And the traders, it was popular with the traders and businessmen who passed through Ostia on the way into Rome. And though the synagogue is in ruins, you can still see the menorah carved in the stones in Ostia. By Tiberius's time, that's about 14 AD now, The Roman Jewish population had grown to about 50,000, and it was becoming an important enough part of the population that the garum makers, and if you know about Roman cooking, Roman food, garum was the classic seasoning sauce on every Roman table. And it's kind of the equivalent of soy sauce today, or I think probably very similar to colatura, which is sort of a very specialized liquid extracted from anchovies, salted anchovies, that's still enjoyed in the Naples area. And similar to soy sauce, Worcestershire, all of these kinds of sauces that we still enjoy today. But there was such a Jewish population, and the Jews had incorporated the garum into their taste and onto their table, that they were making special garum just for the Jewish population that was guaranteed not to have any forbidden species of fish like eels or mollusks in the making of it. So the Jews were already influencing the Roman cuisine at that time. And what they did, as any immigrant population would do, is to incorporate their traditions, their dietary customs, kosher laws, to the ingredients that they found when they got to Rome. Most of the Jews in Rome, and I'm talking about Rome because that seems to be where most of the information is and where the strongest effects were felt and are still felt today. Most of the Jews settled in what is now Trastevere, and they accessed the other side of the Tiber River via the Ponte Fabricio, which was familiarly called the Pons Judaeorum because it was so important for the Jews to cross over the Tiber to get over to the other side, where eventually they built the synagogue. And eventually the population migrated to that side of the Tiber, and that area is what we now think of as the Roman ghetto. If you've ever been to Rome, you know the area well, I'm sure. And it was the area around the Portico Ottavio, the Tiber River, and the Piazza Giudia, where its boundaries. It was a very small area. Other communities also were forming elsewhere along the Italian peninsula, in Modena, Ferrara, Florence. There were very important communities there. And in southern Italy, the Jews were living side by side with the Arab population, and they got along pretty well. Everyone did just fine. Until about the 13th century, when some anti-Semitic laws began to be passed and restrictions were being placed on the Jewish populations. Many of the Jews up until then had been working in the papal court as financial advisors and counselors and doctors and so forth. But things began to change at about this time. So when the Spanish drove the Jews out of Spain and also drove the Arabs out of what is now southern Italy, because remember, of course, that Italy wasn't Italy then. It was a collection of city-states. When the Arabs fled, the Jews also fled from southern Italy, and many of them migrated north, swelling those ghetto populations. And Venice, for example, it had had a smaller population of Jewish residents, but it began to grow, and the government became suspicious and concerned about the influence of the Jews in Venice. And so they confined them to an area around an abandoned cannon foundry. And this foundry in Venetian dialect was called a ghetto. And that word came to be used for any confined area, a neighborhood where particular ethnic groups were confined. So the Jews lived there, and they had high walls all around the ghetto. And within the ghetto, their lives were restricted, and they had very limited access to food that the outside populations were able to find. Especially in Rome, the Roman ghetto was very marshy, it was very poor land that they were living in, very tight quarters. They were forbidden from eating the better cuts of meat. They were limited by laws to what the Romans like to call the quinto quarto, the fifth quarter, which is the discarded parts of the animals. The innards, the tails, the spleen, the spine, and so forth. Women would pick up fish at the fish market. They were only allowed to use what the Italians call pesce azzurro, blue fish, dark-fleshed fish, little fishes like anchovies, mullet, and they would pick up the spare parts from these fish and make fish broth. And the vegetables that they were able to get were primarily artichokes and eggplants and leeks, celery, chicory, things that the rest of the Roman population didn't favor at all. But with creativity and lots of imagination, they managed to create a distinctive cuisine that was palatable to the Romans in the ghetto, and the same thing was happening elsewhere in the ghettos. So the ghetto walls in Rome stood until 1848. And at that time, the laws were taken away, and the Jews were free to leave the ghetto, and people were free to come into the ghetto and to eat some of the food that they found there. And if anyone was here for the talk that we had, the panel on Pellegrino Artusi last year, I talked about this then too. Artusi was a Florentine merchant who wrote the definitive Italian cookbook called La Scienza in Cucina e l'arte di mangiar bene, which means science in the kitchen and the art of eating well. And one of the very interesting passages in his book that has been taken out of the later versions of the book, though one of the versions that I have still includes it, he wrote, and this is a quote, 40 years ago, you could hardly find either eggplant or fennel in the markets because they were considered Jewish food and were abhorred. He goes on to recommend them, stating that, quote, eggplant shouldn't be sneered at because it's neither gassy nor hard to digest. So people were just learning about these absolutely delicious foods that they had never eaten before. And we always think of eggplant and as being so typically Italian, artichokes as being typically Italian, but really until the middle of the 19th century, the people really did not eat them regularly. So they began to become more familiar with them. They were available in the markets. And we then come to World War II, and Rome in particular was supposed to be an open city, but it was devastated by both the Allies and the Germans, and the whole place was a mess. After the war, there were very few restaurants, needless to say, but people knew that they could always go to the old Jewish quarter and get that flavor of old Rome. And there were people began to open little trattorias in their home just to make some money and, cook a few dishes. And that began to be celebrated and recognized by all the Italians, all the Romans, as this is authentic Roman food. You can't get this anywhere anymore. Everyone else is in disarray, but if you go here, you can find these classic dishes, and this is the true Roman cuisine. And nowadays, it's really hard to tell the difference between what's Italian cooking and what is Italian Jewish cooking, because so many of those influences have been incorporated into the Italian cuisine in general. And needless to say, the old ghetto is very chic and very trendy, and we see a resurgence of interest in all of these restaurants that serve Italian Jewish food. And we still go to this day. How many years later? 42 years later. Our first stop when we arrive in Rome is always to the ghetto, to Da Gigetto. That's our favorite restaurant there, for zucchini flowers stuffed with mozzarella and anchovy, and then deep fried in a batter until the outer, the batter and the flowers are crisp as a potato chip, and the inside, the mozzarella and the anchovy just gets all melty and delicious and comes oozing out of that. So we never fail to go there, and we have that. And fried dishes are a specialty. It comes from the Sephardic tradition and the proximity to the Spanish. And also, when the Jews were very poor and confined to that ghetto, they really had no other way to cook. Oil was cheap. You could always take some little bits and pieces and dip them in batter to make the most of them and expand the dish and make what we now call, and pay a lot of money for, frito misto. And, but of course, this was just a way of stretching a small amount of poor ingredients. Other influences that we see are the Jewish cuisine in Italy has a lot of ground meat dishes, meatballs, meatloaves are used a lot, again, because that was very stretchable. You could take a poor cut of meat, chop it all up, add vegetables, and then serve a family with that. Caponata is a perfect example of a dish that's influenced by the Jewish cuisine. It was, many of the traditional dishes were fried and then marinated in vinegar so that they would hold. It was a way of keeping them from spoiling for the Sabbath. And so the food could be prepared ahead, kept at room temperature, and then eaten cold. And caponata, which is a perfect summer dish and eaten really all over Italy today, made again with those eggplants, with celery, with olives, which were always cheap, raisins and pine nuts, one of the signature influences of the Jewish cuisine on Italian cooking. That's another ingredient in caponata that is perfectly common everywhere in Italy today. Quite a few years ago now, my husband and I were in Friuli in the north, in Friuli, Venezia Giulia, and a friend of ours arranged for us to visit a factory that prepared goose products. And throughout Italy, goose was known as the maiale dei ebrei, the pork of the Jews, because the goose was very fatty and very rich, and it could be prepared in so many of the same ways, like a salami, for example, or you could preserve the leg of the goose for prosciutto. They would make foie gras with the liver of the goose. Every bit was eaten. The skin was cooked until really crispy and eaten as almost like a crunchy bacon, the gribness, crunchy bacon to eat as a snack or as a garnish on all kinds of dishes. So while we were there, who came in but none other than Marcella Hazan, who was visiting the area too, and so we shared our tour of the goose factory with her, and she was just as fascinating as I know I was to learn so much about these goose products that are still very popular in northern Italy in particular, and in the regions of Piedmont and Lombardy and Veneto and Friuli, wherever you find Jewish populations. So other dishes, you probably know them as well as me. Lentil soup is a big specialty in Rome in Jewish restaurants. Fried bacala, salt cod, again, is always on the menu. Fried anchovies, just pop them in your mouth. They're delicious, like little popcorn almost. The Jewish artichokes, carciofi alla Judea, deep-fried artichokes, and eat the leaves one at a time, so crispy and delicious. Risotto, pasta is always appropriate with different kinds of vegetables. Lamb, cooked many, many different ways, often with artichokes. In the bakery, in the Jewish ghetto, there's a wonderful bakery. I call it the burnt cheesecake bakery because everything that comes out of that bakery is always burnt, but it's always great, always delicious. And I've never had this in Rome, but an Italian restaurateur here in New York introduced me to cassola, which is somewhere between a cheesecake and a pudding. And it's absolutely delicious if you've never had it. I know the Latanzi restaurant here in New York, which specializes in Roman Jewish food, serves it. And there are several other Jewish restaurants here in New York, Italian Jewish restaurants that you can find. So it's widely available and very trendy. The restaurants in Rome are thriving, and you'll find Italian Jewish restaurants really all over Italy nowadays. If you look online, it's fascinating to see how many there are. So I think that it's safe to say that Italian Jewish cuisine will thrive and go on for another 2,000 years at least. Thank you.
So I'm here to speak about Israeli food and not solely about Jewish food, and it is important to explain that these two are not synonym, although very well connected. In fact, just when I moved to New York 6 years ago, I first introduced to brisket and corned beef and even to knish. These food are not, generally speaking, they are not exist in Israel. A few months ago, a place called the Deli was open in Tel Aviv, but this is more of a bar, late night place where now they serve deli sandwiches, but really it's inspired by New York City spirit and not solely from Jewish food. So the Jewish cuisine, as we know it here, is something very defined, or as you, Ted, said, very almost iconic. It's not the case with Israeli food. Israel is such a young country, it's going to be tomorrow 64. So it's still in a search for its identity. And I think it's a very unique story. Not only day we can witness a birth of a cuisine, and this is quite interesting also because of the setting. And by setting, I refer to the extremely interesting cultural mix that exists in Israel, and to the abundance, the wide variety, of top-notch ingredients. So I don't think there is anywhere now in the world, including other countries in the Middle East, where you can find dishes, interesting dishes like this beautiful eggplant sashimi, or shakshuka, and I don't want to be provocative here, and this shakshuka is, you see, it's served with calamari, but this is part of the reality in Israel, or with chopped liver, as we know it here, but maybe with baby leeks or something like that, and it's very popular in bars. Or it is beautiful Israeli pizza, or shrimp in a pita, because we stuff everything in a pita, including shrimp recently. And of course, this endless variety of fresh, creative salads. But still, what is Israeli food? So in order to get a fresh start to our discussion today, I wanted to share with you some of the thoughts of 3 prominent chefs in Israel. So the first one is Erez Komorovsky, who is a legendary chef in Israel and the founder of the Galilee Cooking School. And Erez said, let me quote him, "Chopped fresh salad is the essence of our cuisine. Lots of lemon juice, olive oil, and sun vegetables. This salad is a must in our breakfast and also in our supper. It is strange, though, that the most Israeli food is called Arabic salad." And he added a smiley to his email. Our next chef, Omer Miller, is the star of the younger generation of Israeli chefs. And he gave me a completely different answer. For him, the most Israeli dish is a steak in a pita, or grilled goose liver on the skewer, or other top quality meats. This combination of high quality ingredients with the most basic preparation and the fact that Israelis love eating this food make them the ultimate Israeli dishes. And here we have Chef Eyal Cohen, which I couldn't get a hold of him, but I thought it's important to share. I mean, I can only guess what would be his answer, and I'm sure it would be related somehow to the taste of tomatoes. And Israelis just love tomatoes, and we have great tomatoes, and just wanted to share this with you. And last one is Chef Chaim Cohen, who is a TV personality, celebrity chef in Israel, and he is also considered to be the godfather of new Israeli cuisine. And he said, it is almost impossible to answer this question because Israel is too young to define its cuisine. Myself and other chefs of my generation were the first to serve foie gras with tahini in upscale restaurants. I also started to serve burnt eggplant like my mother made at home, and paired it with lamb chops or placed them inside tiny tortellini. Oh, and I replaced the traditional pasta dough with kreplach dough. He concluded this way: any dish that will modernly assemble local ingredients that were partially prepared in our mother's methods and will be plated with high aesthetics and generosity is Israeli. Well, I think that this different answer can be served as an evidence to the state of the cuisine, a cuisine in a making, or as Jana Gur, the editor of On the Table, which is the leading food and wine magazine in Israel, once said, it is a baby cuisine. And for me, what's interesting is that this cuisine has more than 60 Jewish mothers that arrived from all over the world, from places far apart as Morocco, India, Poland, or Hungary. And some of us know the effect of one Jewish mother. So you can imagine what is 60 Jewish mother. I think it's a killer recipe for a split personality. And it's true. Israelis, we are asking ourselves, what are we? Are we European, Middle Eastern, Jewish? And today in Israel, young Jewish chefs are searching for inspiration in Jewish ethnic food. For example, jachnun or kubana, these are food that Yemen Jews used to eat in Yemen for many, many years for Shabbat. So it's basically dough rolled with fat, cooked overnight and served for Shabbat breakfast with hard-boiled egg and grated tomato. And today, it is very popular street food in Israel, and people from all backgrounds love it. And not only that, it became trendy to serve this kind of street food, Jewish ethnic food, in upscale restaurants like this example. This called the Mizlala. It's the new restaurant by Chef Meir Adoni. And I know this looks like a brioche to you, also to me, but this is a kubana. And here we have another quick example of ethnic Jewish food that became all Israeli favorite, and this is, of course, a sabich, another food where Jews used to eat for many, many years, this time in Iraq. And in Iraq, they used to eat it for Shabbat breakfast. It is a cold spread made from eggplant, tahini, hard-boiled egg, and amba, which is a spicy condiment made from unripe mangoes. And today, again, it's super popular all over Israel, and it's also available here in New York. And Israeli chefs are doing very interesting variation on this dish. And this one is actually by Erez Komorovsky, where he served it last summer at the Beard House here in New York. So this variety of Jewish ethnic food I think it's available for chefs because Israel is a cooking nation. People really know how to cook in Israel. And I recently heard this conversation at the Heritage Radio where Mitchell Davis interviewed James Ostland, the editor of Savar magazine, and James said that it was relatively recently where Americans learned to cook. In Israel, it's not the case. And people love to cook, and family is maybe the highest in the system value, in the value system in Israel. So, for example, Friday night dinner is a mandatory institution all across the country where people gather around the table, talk about or argue about politics, and enjoying a great home-cooked meal making from scratch. So this, and of course, this inspired the food culture, the restaurant scene in Israel. So even in the most fancy restaurant in Tel Aviv today, like Rafael of Chef Rafi Cohen, you can find is serving couscous or other recipes by his grandma, by his Moroccan grandma Aziza. So I think that this search for identity led Israelis to look for inspiration in the local terroir and in their traditions. And so up until the 90s, when we wanted to go to celebrate something, we used to go to a French restaurant or to Italian or for a Chinese. That was a celebration for us. It's not longer the case. I mean, there are still a wide variety of great restaurants in Israel, but the most popular and critically acclaimed and loved ones are Israelis. And these restaurants are branded themselves as New Israeli. So this is a good example. This is Herbert Samuel. This is another really great example you can't really see, but this one is North Abraxas. And this one is, of course, Machne Yehuda, which is a restaurant located in the heart of the Machne Yehuda market in Jerusalem. So I truly believe that even though the definition are still to be put together, or it's still in the search, Israeli cuisine, Israel is on the verge of a culinary golden age. So, thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank each of the panelists for their very interesting remarks, and I'd also like to thank Terry Gordon for inviting me to moderate. Although I'm the director of Jewish Studies at Eugene College here at the New School, food is not my area of expertise. I mean, aside from just the consumer of it. And up until today, I didn't realize that Jewish food could actually photograph so well. So I was really sort of impressed with that. But I think I'll ask kind of maybe one big question that each of you could address in any way you like, and then we'll see if we can open it up to the audience. And my question last year I organized a panel also in conjunction with Jewish Cultural Studies and the Posen Foundation here at the New School, but it was about Jewish humor. And a lot of what I was hearing kind of reminded me of the same tensions and dynamics as we observed when we discussed that topic. That, in other words, cuisine, like humor, is both incredibly specific and incredibly fluid and universal at the same time, right? I mean, Jewish humor, you could say, is specific because, well, you could argue that it comes from the irony of Jewish chosenness vis-a-vis Jewish history and the pressures of modernity. And then, of course, Jewish irony becomes this kind of commodified global brand, right? And Jewish cuisine, I mean, what's more, what's more specific than cuisine, than taste and smell, right? In terms of something that marks one's identity, and very often one's national or ethnic identity, or religious identity. When you're talking about Jewish cuisine, you're also talking about kashrut, inevitably, whether the way that it's shaped by kashrut or shaped by departure from it, right? And also, interestingly, when you're talking about such phenomena as Marranos, Conversos, and crypto-Jews, right? Very often, the only identifiable markers of a Jewish community are these strange things that this particular group of people in the Portuguese countryside eat, right? That somehow marks them, and whether they know it or not, as being descendants of converted Jews, right? Recently, there was even an article where using this kind of evidence, a scholar argued that something like 75% of Palestinian Arabs have Jewish roots because they eat things that other Arabs in the region don't eat, right? And then of course cuisine is also never pure, right? On the other hand, cuisine is never pure. Just like potatoes are not Irish, and just like borscht is not Russian, it's Ukrainian, right? And for that matter, potatoes are not Russian, which was news to me growing up in Moscow. It's 3 days, 3 meals a day, potatoes, right? So I was wondering how each of you kind of think through or imagine this tension between the specificities of Jewish food versus the sort of absolutely universal and very fluid nature of cuisines. Any of you?
Doesn't matter.
All of you. I would love to hear from each of you on this.
Well, I think that a lot of what you're pointing to is really a point that I learned by speaking to so many people from so many different cultures. And what a Hungarian Jew has in common with a Hungarian who is not Jewish is really the food that they've all enjoyed. There is nothing intrinsically Jewish about a Linzer tart, yet I was given a recipe for a Linzer tart from a woman who, survived the Holocaust, and it was a food that she ate in her home, and it was something they baked every week for Shabbat, but there's nothing really intrinsically, what makes a cookie Jewish? I mean, really, what makes any one of these foods intrinsically related to this specific culture? And I really think there is nothing specific. I think all people, food is just such a shared experience. You were talking about the Italian influences. I mean, whether you call it gravy on a Sunday and it's, surrounding braciole, or it's, used as an element in what maybe a Jewish family would consider their Sunday dish, what really is the difference? It's just the cuisine of that region, and I don't think there's anything inherently Jewish about most foods. My point has always been it's made Jewish by the people who prepare it and the ways that you eat it and the associations that we make, but it's no more or less Jewish to have, chow mein on a Sunday night. That's awfully Jewish ritual when I was growing up. What really makes that a Jewish food? Nothing, but it became a traditional thing in my home on every Friday night. You speak to kosher. I write kosher cookbooks. I'm not kosher. My sister once pointed out the fallacy that James Patterson is not a serial killer, and he writes about them, that you don't really have to be what you write about, happily. But kosher is something that we always think of defines Jewish food, but there are so many people who follow many of the kosher rules because they feel it brings a cleanliness element to the food, a healthful element to the food. Again, you don't even have to be Jewish to be kosher anymore. So I think Jewish cuisine is really almost undefinable. And I think that's the common ground of all Jewish food. I don't think you can really define it.
Are we just going to?
Yeah, sure.
No, I would definitely agree with that. I mean, one of the things that's interesting about Jewish food is that it's always been a kind of fusion cuisine. It's always been a kind of hybrid. And I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that Jews were so mobile throughout so much of our history. That Jews were the merchants and the traders, and they were the ones, as one cookbook author says, they were the vehicles of gastronomic knowledge. They moved all over the place, and they brought with them recipes and spices and cooking techniques and so on. And they also absorbed so much from the surrounding cultures that they lived in. So it's very hard to get to the kind of essential nature of any dish. I mean, chances are it was borrowed from whatever countries and peoples that Jews lived among. What's interesting to me, though, is that then in the United States, there were certain foods that did become associated with Jews, that Jews claimed a kind of connection to, a kind of ownership of. And then, as I mentioned in my remarks, I think there was a kind of assimilation, both of Jews into American society and of Jewish foods into America. And so nowadays, just like the bagel is, I think for Jews, probably the bagel still is a Jewish food, particularly if you wake up on Sunday morning and you have to have bagels and cream cheese and lox and, read the New York Times. But I think for millions of Americans, a bagel has no ethnic associations whatsoever. And there are other Jewish foods that are going the way of the bagel in that sense. I mean, pastrami, for example. Pastrami you can buy at any, Cuisines or Subway. Maybe there's a cycle that takes place in which Jews, and maybe this is happening in Israel to a certain extent. I like the whole idea of the sort of the 70 mothers, but somehow, the food that certain dishes sort of get amalgamated from different cultures, and then maybe they get sort of diffused, and then maybe the process starts all over again.
Did you want to comment now?
Just a quick comment that I think what's very interesting in Israel is that you can see it, as I said before, in the making, and because of this mix of marriage and then in the food, it's interesting to see examples that are like this fusion in the plate. So in one typical lunch in Israel, whether it's in a cafe or in a home, you can find on the same plate a schnitzel that originally came from Austria, with couscous, which obviously came from Morocco, and with a Polish pickle. So it's like 3 different things that are speaking now. So that's for me.
Well, it's like you can get a schnitzel in a pita, right?
Everything in a pita.
That's a classic, yeah.
Everything
right.
in a pita, yeah. It's the now culture, so yeah.
Well, I think that we shouldn't lose sight of the fact, though, that this happens in every cuisine. I'm Italian. I'm 100% Italian. My family all came from the Naples area. But who were they? Were they Greeks that settled Naples, Neapolis originally? Were they descendants? Did they intermarry with the Spanish that came through Italy and ruled the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies for centuries? Am I a descendant of the Romans, or maybe a wayward Tuscan? Or it could be anything. And the same thing happened with Italian food. The Arabs brought their influence, and they say that that's where pasta originated, in the Middle East or in somewhere. Or perhaps it was the Etruscans who made pasta. No one's quite sure about that. The only thing we're sure of, it was not Marco Polo in China. I mean, that might have, pasta may have evolved about the same time in China, but the Chinese didn't have wheat, so it wasn't pasta as we think of it. So the Phoenicians came through, the Greeks came through, the Spanish were there, the French were there. Everybody was there in southern Italy, certainly. In the north, you had the Germans, the Austrians coming. And what did they do? They ate. Everybody ate. And they brought their influences. They left their recipes. You mentioned that very interesting dish, the cubana. Did you call the cubana? In Friuli, you'll find gubana, which is a bread. It's a sweet bread, and it's also a spiral. And it's a Christmas specialty in the Friuli region. So were they related? Is there some connection there. I don't know. I can't say this is the first time I've heard of this, but I think that every cuisine, if we go back and look far enough, is a synthesis, is a combination of all of the people who have contributed to it and had something, have cooked and eaten in that place.
You just blew my mind about the Marco Polo and the noodles.
Sorry.
I'm devastated.
Absolutely not.
Perhaps let's take some questions from the audience. Yes.
Is there any relationship between garam masala and garam?
No, well, they're not. The question was garam masala, which is an Indian spice mixture, and garam. I certainly don't know of any, and it's very different because the Indian version, it is Indian, isn't it? Is a spice blend of ground dried spices, whereas garam, the Roman, was a liquid, dark brown, I assume. Think of like soy sauce or Worcestershire.
For the mic.
I have a question concerning the recent Ethiopian immigration to Israel. Have the Ethiopians opened up any interesting restaurants or added anything interesting? I really don't know much about Ethiopian cuisine, but it seems like around it must have been like 100,000 in the last several decades have come there. I'm just wondering, have they sort of added anything interesting to the culinary mix that you are aware of?
They surely brought some, I mean, I was privileged to go to some friends' houses and try really amazing things, but I have to admit that it's not something that is very prominent in the current food culture. There are very few Ethiopian restaurants in Israel, but it is interesting to think why it's not more evident in the culture, in that mix. And I think it's also very true to the Russian immigrants that came to Israel later. And it also not so affected in the mix.
Okay.
These two immigration waves.
Okay, thank you.
I very much enjoyed hearing about all the different kinds of food. I think it's important to recognize that within Jewish cuisine, there is Ashkenazic cuisine and Sephardic cuisine. And when June spoke about the things that were at her Passover Seder that were so important to her identifying herself with the past, not one of those was at my Sephardic Seder.
And I'm Sephardic. So it's interesting that you say that because I have a combination of both. My mother's family is Ashkenazi, but our main traditions are roasted brown eggs, which are at my Seder. I'm sure they're at yours. And matzah meat cakes like minya that you make. Right. And so I have many of those. We have a combination of both.
Right. But it's just important for people not to think that there is a unilateral cuisine that is typified by the Ashkenazic food that many of you have presented. Not so much. The Israeli cuisine is quite a blend. And yes, there are a few Ethiopian restaurants in Israel. I was at one recently, not so great, although it was touted to be the best. Not so great. They could use more.
My mother has a cousin from Tennessee. When she comes up every few years, the first thing she does when she comes to this area is beeline it to one of the delis for pastrami and all the things that she can't get in Tennessee, although she grew up in New Jersey. Which brings to my question, by her coming here, I always get the feeling now, thinking about this in this context, by coming here, does she think maybe it's more authentic coming from New York and therefore making it more regional, having the Jewish food from the New York City area? And if your ideas on that or comments to that.
What are you saying, Peter, about the...
Well, if she's coming from somewhere, if she comes to New York, does that make it more authentic Jewish than having the pastrami at a kosher place in California or something, just centralizing it.
Probably
Does it
better.
change your,
LA might have better delis at this point.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting in which
The irony.
interesting the ways in which New York food, and not just New York deli food, but New York pizza and whatever, New York bagels, or things that were associated with New York, who took the name New York as a way of trying to make the case that they were more authentic. Whether or not they actually are, I don't know, but I think in line with what I was saying about context, the fact that she's coming to New York to eat these foods, or that she's, finding a certain meaning in eating them in New York, probably does add to the experience for a lot of people, because there are other memories that get triggered, and there's a whole sense of culture that people have in coming to New York that they're embedded in, an urban Jewish culture. But I don't know. I mean, you'd have to ask her, I guess, how she feels about it.
I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the role of Jewish cuisine in the restaurant world currently, with new restaurants like Jack's Pie Freda and Kutcher's Tribeca and Jezebel. Just what your thoughts on what's going on with that, what you think the future of Jewish cuisine in restaurants are. Obviously, they've come a long way from the first delis here.
Well, I always think that the future is, if you look back 40 years in the past, you can predict the future. And so I think whatever was trendy 40 years ago is what's going to be trendy a year from now. And it's just the way that pendulum swings. People are looking for foods and things that just make them feel better, and those ultimate comfort foods. That's why you have the meatball shop, because who doesn't really want to have a big pot of gravy and meatballs? It's perfect food. And I think that's the same thing with the trends that we're seeing in some of the Jewish-styled restaurants that are coming up. I read today that Mile End Deli that's in Brooklyn is opening in Soho. If you've never had it, Montreal smoked meats, they're amazing. It's something that's now making its way here into our food scene. Why? Because it's something that was eaten so many years ago that was, really iconic to Montreal, and it's making its way here. So look in the past, and you'll be able to predict the future.
But I just wanted to say very quickly that what's really interesting, I think, is the ways in which a lot of this food is aggressively treif. I mean, there's even a restaurant called treif, and that's what I was thinking when Naama was talking about Israel, I mean, what is that saying? How far can you stretch, how elastic is the definition of Jewish food? How far can you stretch it and have it still be Jewish food? Which is, I think, what you're seeing in Israel.
Right, but also what you see now in Israel, and I think it's related to your question because it's a little bit like you see it more here, it's more prominent here, but also in Israel, there is some revival for Jewish Ashkenazi foods, and I think it's probably because of the fact that we are now third generation, and so we are far enough to feel nostalgia to this food and to long for it and to want to celebrate it.
There's also one more thing, which is that, if you saw the article by Joan Nathan in the New York Times last year about Passover Seders in restaurants, the ways in which restaurants are becoming places for people to celebrate Jewish holidays and, in a sense, maybe displacing the idea of celebrating, holidays like Passover at home.
Yeah, I think that doesn't Mile End on its menu, they have a grilled salami sandwich. I think it's called treif.
Yeah, and there's,
right?
I don't know if anybody knows the restaurant Jodo. It's in the East Village. Great little place, and they have a sandwich called the Ambivalent Jew. It's chopped liver and bacon on challah. But again, Jewish food and kosher food are two completely different subjects. They have a lot in common, but they're not necessarily the same thing. It can be Jewish food without being kosher.
Yeah. There are very few actual kosher delis in the city that left. I mean, a kosher style.
Very few.
Right. I mean, Katz's is not kosher.
No.
There's a question over there. Yes.
Sort of related to the comments that have just been made. If so much of what you're referring to as sort of like the Jewish lifestyle, Jewish life is so associated with Jewish food, and as Jewish food is becoming assimilated into overall American culture and Israeli culture and so on, What do you think, how do you think this is affecting Judaism? I mean, Judaism is not just Jewish food. I mean, that Jewish food can be tray food is, I simply don't understand that.
I don't really think I have an answer to that. I think the interesting thing about Judaism, and probably what is one of our best trademarks and also our most confusing, is that there are so many interpretations and so many different things, like kosher style. There is no such thing as kosher style. Either you're kosher or you're not kosher. It's like being a little pregnant, when speaking to people who are strictly kosher. And in writing my second book, I spoke, and it's a strictly kosher cookbook. And they laughed at me, and when I mentioned Worcestershire sauce, there was a whole controversy over, well, it has trace amounts of anchovy in it, and therefore, is it now, making trafe out of a dish that I thought was perfectly kosher? It's a very salient point. You're correct. It's hard to separate the two, and you sort of wonder, where does the boundaries go, and how washed down and watered down are they, and what's really left is the essence. I think it's really left to each person's individual interpretation of what makes something feel Jewish to them. It's not the food that makes it Jewish. It's the experience that makes it Jewish. That's really, what I maintain. I think a Jewish dinner can be, pizza if you eat it because you're surrounded by your family and you're celebrating something wonderful and an event. Well, what makes that any less Jewish? I think, it's really the experience of the food, not necessarily the food itself.
You could also argue that Jewish culture is getting more and more, more and more disembodied in a sense, as with technology and with so much being on the internet and kind of virtual, that maybe Jewish culture doesn't necessarily depend anymore on actually having people together in a room in the way it used to be. I mean, now you can even have a minion online.
Just a quick comment. It's the first time I actually thought about Jewish food. I didn't think about it until I came here, because as Jews, it's really a global food, because we were the people without a country. So I don't think you have Christian food or Muslim food, but you have Chinese food and you have Italian food. So I think 65 years ago, there was no country called Israel, so it was disseminated across the world. So I think if you look at what you call Jewish food, it's really global food. I mean, I would not call, the only thing I know about Jewish food is really kosher food. So if you take a kosher aside, you've got a really global food, and the state of Israel eventually will evolve into what people think Jewish people eat, because that's the only place you've got Israeli food, because I think there is nothing called Ethiopian food. It's just a bunch of Jewish people who came from Africa, and the food is not really good. But I think that's what my personal opinion. But I think that the French food, there's French, kosher food, but it's not French Jewish food. So I think it's really Jewish food is really global food. Just as a comment, I never thought about it till now.
Could I say? Okay, I've got it. I think that we've got the beginnings with Jewish food started out as kosher food. There wasn't very much different between being Jewish and being kosher. And I think that's the unifying characteristic. Now, we've got lots of different communities, and so there's the food of the different regions. But if we're talking about Jewish food, the beginnings was kosher food and the creativity that developed in keeping milk and meat separate and all the other requirements that kashrut demands on a creative chef. And I think that we're sort of losing something by not acknowledging that that's where it all began. And we've come different ways, come to different places, and I think one of the major influences of Russian food in Israel now is the presence of pork. But I somehow feel like people are trying to not pay attention to the fact that we started out with kashrut. We've done different things, And the different communities, you can have Ashkenazic food, you can have Sephardic food, you can have Yemenite food, all of those different communities. But the essence really was kashrut. What we do with it as a people is a whole other conversation. But in terms of cuisine, I think that's really an essential point.
Over there.
Actually wanted to go back to the question about Ethiopian food. I happen to be Ethiopian, and I'm sorry you don't like the food, but one of the questions about Ethiopian food and its influence on Israeli food is the fact that Ethiopian migration is fairly recent. Even though we have Jews in Ethiopia, they've ended up in Israel. That migration is fairly recent, and the crop is not available. I mean, there are ingredients that are not available anywhere in the world that are very specifically indigenous to Ethiopia. And looking at the slides of the dishes that you have, for example, shakishuka is a dish that I have a Southern Italian restaurant, and in our restaurant we serve shakishuka, which in Arabic is shaken up.
Right.
And that appears now. So it's the ingredients that are available, and what you do with them is what has now become Israeli food. Because looking at a lot of the dishes that are it's the crop that you have accessible to you.
I think it's a combination of the crops, the ingredients, and the traditions that people came and brought with them. And so I agree with the comment that someone said earlier. It was a constant negotiation between the Jewish laws and the local traditions. So that, yeah.
My idea of when people ask me what Jewish food is, at least according to my idea, I always say there is no Jewish food. It's where people came from. My family came from Russia and Eastern Europe, and everything they did was that style. Those were the Ashkenazi Jews. The Sephardic Jews are the ones that came from Arab countries, and so those are very similar to where they came from. The food is where, at least with Jews it seems, wherever they lived. That's what the style. They may have changed it a little bit. They couldn't use pork, so they used other meat. But my mother makes stuffed cabbage without pork. But it's identical to anything you'll get in a Russian restaurant. And borscht, and so that's my idea. When people ask about Jewish food, I don't know how to separate it, really. And I think as far as places like Kutches and all that are becoming trendy in New York, what's happening is that all the second and third generation Jews that have lost a lot of what it is, all of a sudden are getting the idea that, let's go and have something that my grandmother made, or that seems to be the way a lot of the second and third generation Jews are handling those kind of trendy places. Thank you.
I just want to say that if you insist that Jewish food has to be kosher, you're cutting out large portions of the Jewish population. And I think that Jewish food in Israel is not always kosher. Jewish food going back 200, 300 years. In Europe, Jews didn't keep kosher all the time. There were Jews who were secular Jews. And I think that when you say that Jewish food has to be kosher, you're cutting off large portions. Almost 50% of American Jews don't keep kosher. And more than. And if you say that Jewish food has to be kosher.
I don't think anyone's saying that. I think,
Well,
yeah.
No, I didn't say that it has to be, but I think at the very beginning, the concept of keeping separate, I mean, that was the beginning of kosher food, of Jewish food. It's very different now. I'm not saying that it has to be. It's a choice that a person makes. But the beginnings of what is Jewish food, that was a major difference. That's how Jews kept separate from the rest of the peoples around. And that there's a whole conversation you can have about that in terms of kosher wine and what that means. But the beginning was not mixing milk and meat. And cuisines came up around that. It's changed.
Well, and let me just say that, I mean, when you say the beginning, the kosher laws actually developed over a period of time. And all the Bible says, I mean, all the Torah says, right, is that you shall not see the kid in its mother's milk. But originally, I mean, so that just means that you can't cook an animal in the milk of its own mother. So originally, it seems that it was fine to cook milk and meat together, as long as you, I mean, it would actually take quite a bit of effort to make sure, you know, I mean, it would be very unusual to end up with the milk of the mother of the animal. So if you read David Kramer's book, he's a JTS professor who just came out with a book a couple of years ago called Jewish Eating and Identity. He traces the whole evolution of the kosher laws over time.
Maybe one more question over here.
I just wanted to ask Naama a question, because we spend a lot of time eating in Israel also, and we do honor the kosher rules as an aside. But so considering that Israeli cuisine is so varied and it's such a reflection of culture and terroir and climate and, you know, availability and growing, you know, all that goes into it. So if you had to, if you could choose 3 restaurants or 3 meals in Israel, considering this vast diversity, let's say maybe in Tel Aviv, where would you go? And what kinds of things would you be eating for breakfast, lunch, and dinner?
Wow, this is a challenge. So breakfast is probably the most glorious of all meals that you can have in Israel, because it's so rich and has so much things into it. So I would probably choose to go to Mantarei, which is a restaurant at the beach in Tel Aviv, right before Jaffa. And the beach in Tel Aviv is part of the city, is part of the culture. So it's the closest you can get to this really, really great experience. And they offer like original Israeli breakfast with the Israeli salad and very nice variety of cheese and orange juice and great coffee, and you have the beautiful view of the beach, so that would be my choice to start the day. For lunch, I would probably go to Jaffa to eat hummus, and it's interesting that we didn't even mention hummus, but hummus is a big thing in Israel. It's a cult food. People love to go out to eat hummus, and people don't make it at home most of the time. So I would go to Abu Hassan, just a very basic hummus place that only offers hummus, nothing else. So it is fluffy, warm, healthy. So that would be my choice for lunch, and I think it will match your vegetarian. Okay, great, let's do that. And eat with pita bread, not with knife and forks. And for dinner, wow, there really is such a big variety. But maybe something special, maybe to go to Nanuchka, which is a Georgian restaurant. And not only that the food is so interesting and delicious, it's just a very happy experience. So, thank you.
Well, I think before we move on to the gustatory portion of this event, I'd like to thank our panelists again, June, Ted, Michele, and Naama. And thank you for coming.